when you are dealing with a medical diagnosis, there is a certain expectation of precision. It's almost like engineering.
Yeah, you fall, you break your arm, you go to a hospital.
Right. And the doctor throws the x-ray up on the light board, and there is that undeniable, jagged white line right across the bone.
Exactly. The doctor points to it and says, there's the problem. It's incredibly binary. The fracture is either there or it isn't.
You can't really debate the bone.
No, you can't.
It's clean. And frankly, it's comforting, right? We like things to be visible, neatly categorized, and entirely indisputable. We want to know exactly what is broken so we can fix it.
Naturally.
But when you step out of the hospital and into the realm of cultural analysis, when you try to diagnose the health of an entire society, that x-ray machine kind of shatters.
It completely shatters.
Suddenly you are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. Everyone is pointing to a different shadow on the film, claiming that they found the fracture.
Which is where things get really messy.
Right. But what if someone came along and claimed they possessed the ultimate high-definition X-ray for Western civilization? A diagnostic tool that could point to the exact historical, biological, and philosophical fracture causing all of our modern chaos.
Well, today we are opening up a massive, deeply controversial new ebook that claims to be exactly that.
Yeah, and if you are someone who is deeply invested in understanding the history of our institutions specifically, understanding how they functioned before they were allegedly captured by feminists and Marxists, this deep dive is absolutely for you.
It is a text that pulls zero punches, and it is generating a massive amount of friction online.
That might be the understatement of the year. We are exploring a book called Bolt of Zeus, Classical Masculine Power and Its Philosophical Defense by Conrad Riker.
A really heavy title.
It is. And right off the top, I want to let you know that this book is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's an absolute must-read if you want to understand the modern manosphere. And if you want to follow the author's ongoing essays, you can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Highly recommend checking those out.
Absolutely. Now, before we start unpacking the incredibly dense layers of this manifesto, I want to ask you to please like and subscribe to this deep dive. It's literally how we keep bringing you these highly detailed, custom-tailored explorations of the most fascinating ideas shaping our world.
And, the ideas in this text are shaping a very specific, very vocal part of the culture right now.
They really are. Which brings me to our exact mission for this deep dive. Our goal today is not to validate this text, and it is not to condemn it.
Right. We are acting strictly as your impartial guides here.
Exactly. We aren't taking a side. We aren't endorsing the author's political or social viewpoints, and we definitely aren't validating the claims made about the political left, women, or Marxist theory.
Our job is pure analysis.
Yep. We want to help you understand exactly how this movement, often broadly called the manosphere or the men's rights movement, constructs its reality. We're going to look at the exact arguments they make, the historical lenses they look through, and the mechanics of their worldview.
Think of us as intellectual cartographers. We are just mapping the terrain of the argument so you can see the architecture of how these ideas connect.
I love that. And the central architecture of Bolt of Zeus is essentially a declaration of ideological war.
It really is. The core thesis is that the foundational institutions of Western civilization were built exclusively on what the author defines as masculine logic.
Meaning objective reality, strict meritocracy, and a rigid chain of command.
Exactly. But according to Riker, those institutions have been systematically captured.
Captured by what? Exactly.
By what he calls female-coded Marxism and emotional chaos.
Wow.
Yeah. The book argues that over the last century, society has basically traded the rigorous pursuit of objective truth for the validation of emotional fragility.
And he claims this swap is causing a systemic collapse across the board, right? From the economy to the justice system.
Precisely. And the ultimate call to action is that men must wake up to this capture and reclaim their biological sovereignty.
So it's a massive, sweeping claim about the fall of civilization. But what's fascinating to me is that the author doesn't start this epic thesis by quoting ancient philosophers or citing macroeconomic data.
No, he doesn't.
He starts the book exactly where his own worldview crystallized. It's an inciting incident that happens in a very mundane setting, which, makes it incredibly relatable for a lot of people, even if they draw a totally different conclusion from it.
Oh, you mean the scene at the mahogany table?
Yes, the mahogany table. It's the origin story of his entire ideology.
So picture this. The author is sitting across a polished mahogany table in a sterile corporate office.
Right.
Sitting opposite him is an HR executive, And Riker paints a very specific, fairly ruthless portrait of this executive, calling her a, quote, mediocre specialist in emotional fragility.
Which is a brutal description.
Very brutal. But the context here is crucial. Riker claims he had just delivered a record-breaking financial quarter for his company.
Wait, so he was actually performing well?
Better than well. He says he stepped into a failing, bleeding division and rescued it through sheer force of will, aggressive metrics, and what he calls logical restructuring.
So he saved the company millions.
Exactly. Millions. But instead of sitting at that table to receive a promotion or a massive bonus, he is being formally reprimanded.
Why? Because he didn't hit his numbers.
No, the numbers were perfect. He was reprimanded because his direct communication style made some members of the team feel unsafe.
Unsafe, like physically.
No, emotionally unsafe.
No.
He didn't use soft language. He didn't build consensus. He just gave orders, pointed out failures objectively, and demanded compliance.
And for Riker, this isn't just a mildly annoying day at the office where you roll your eyes, take the sensitivity training, and go back to your desk.
Not at all. He treats this moment like a massive epiphany.
It's his Galileo moment.
Yeah, he writes that sitting across from that HR executive, he literally witnessed the parasites breaching the gates of Western civilization.
That is quite the escalation.
It is. He looks at the society around him, the society that split the atom, mapped the human genome, and built the internet, and he is horrified that this exact civilization is now demanding that highly competent, rational men apologize for their competence.
Just to soothe the feelings of people who are producing less value.
Exactly. That's his core grievance.
He's taking a standard, modern corporate conflict resolution process and scaling it up to the level of an existential threat. And to explain how human resources departments actually function today, he uses a really brilliant rhetorical analogy.
A fairy tale analogy, right?
Yes. He compares modern HR to the swindling weavers in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes.
That's a fascinating comparison. Let's break down the mechanics of why he uses that specific story.
Okay, so in the 1837 fairy tale, these con artist weavers come to town and convince the emperor they're weaving him a magnificent suit of clothes. But the catch is, the fabric is completely invisible to anyone who is stupid, incompetent, or unfit for their position.
Right, so the weavers just mime making the clothes.
Exactly. And because everyone from the ministers down to the emperor himself is terrified of being outed as incompetent or stupid, they all pretend they can clearly see this beautiful, non-existent fabric.
And Riker says this is exactly what is happening in the corporate world right now.
Yep. He argues that human resources is no longer an administrative department that just handles, payroll, benefits, and vacation days.
Right. He claims HR has metastasized into a secular morality police.
Secular morality police.
According to the book, these departments manufacture an invisible, ever-changing standard of emotional compliance and inclusive terminology. A fabric they claim is the height of progressive, enlightened management.
What happens if you can't see the fabric?
Well, Riker argues that no rational, logical, system-oriented mind can actually see this fabric because it doesn't exist in objective reality. It doesn't produce capital. It doesn't build products.
Yeah.
Yet, the entire corporate hierarchy is forced to nod along with these absurdities under the very real threat of professional destruction.
So if you are the little boy in the crowd who points and says, hey, the emperor is naked, or in this case, if you point out biological realities, or point out that a diversity initiative is statistically lowering output, you are immediately destroyed. You are labeled toxic.
Exactly. You are excommunicated. And Riker doesn't just ask the reader to take his word for it based on his one bad afternoon with HR.
Right. He needs a larger proof of concept.
Yeah, he points to a massively public, highly controversial, real-world event to anchor this theory. The firing of Google engineer James Damore.
This is a perfect test case for his theory. Take us through how Riker interprets the Damore incident, because it's so central to his argument about institutional capture.
Okay, so for some context, in 2017, James Damore was a software engineer at Google.
Right, I remember this.
He wrote an internal memo, a very detailed, heavily cited document, suggesting that the reason there aren't perfectly equal numbers of men and women in tech and leadership roles might not be entirely due to systemic sexism.
Right.
He suggested it could be partially explained by differences in biological predispositions and population-level trait distributions.
And when the memo leaked, the internal uproar was massive, and Google fired him.
And for Riker, the irony of where this happened is the whole point.
Oh, because it's Google.
Precisely. Google is arguably the pinnacle of extreme computation. Riker points out that this is a company that employs engineers capable of mapping the infinite complexities of neural networks.
They literally build systems like AlphaGo that can calculate millions of variables a second to defeat human grandmasters.
Right. It is a cathedral of logic, but when one of those highly logical engineers applied that same analytical, data-driven approach to human biology and workplace dynamics, the corporation fired him.
Wow.
Riker uses this as undeniable proof that the corporate hierarchy no longer prioritizes objective truth.
So he's saying when forced to choose between empirical data and emotional comfort, the corporation chose to sacrifice its most competent minds.
At the altar of what he calls female-coded emotional fragility.
Okay, so looking at this impartially, I really need to push back on this premise.
Go for it.
It seems like he's interpreting basic risk management as ideological surrender. Because realistically, if you have thousands of employees threatening to strike or walk out because a memo is creating immense internal friction, the company is going to fire the source of the friction.
Because friction halts productivity.
Right, friction costs money. The HR department isn't necessarily executing a Marxist takeover. They might just be protecting the quarterly earnings report from an internal civil war.
That is the standard, pragmatic economic counterargument. But Riker preemptively attacks that exact line of thinking.
How does he get around that?
He argues that avoiding short-term friction by sacrificing objective truth is the exact mechanism that causes the long-term collapse of the company.
Ah, I see.
He fundamentally believes that prioritizing safety over competence is a biological glitch. You are introducing a virus into the system just to keep the peace, but the virus will eventually eat the system.
And that transitions us directly into the physiological foundation of his entire book.
Right, because if the corporate world is crashing, Riker argues it's because it's running on the wrong hardware.
He traces the problem from the mahogany table in the HR office all the way down into the neurobiology that he claims built the office in the first place. Let's look at this biological argument.
This is where Riker leans heavily and selectively on evolutionary psychology and neuroscience.
Okay.
He anchors his biological argument on the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, specifically his 2003 book, The Essential Difference.
And it's important to note for you listening that Baron-Cohen's work is actual peer-reviewed science from a Cambridge professor, even if Riker is taking the conclusions to an ideological extreme.
Absolutely.
What is the core concept of the extreme male brain that Riker borrows here?
Well, Baron-Cohen proposed the empathizing systemizing theory of typical sex differences. According to Riker's interpretation of this, the male brain is biologically hardwired by evolution for systemizing.
And systemizing means what, exactly?
It's the drive to hunt down truth, to categorize data, to understand the exact mechanical parts of a system, and to build robust structures based on objective reality.
Okay, so if a bridge falls down, the systemizing brain doesn't care how the bridge felt about falling.
Exactly. It cares about the tensile strength of the steel that failed.
And he contrasts this with the female brain.
Yes. He claims the female brain is biologically hardwired for hyperempathy and social consensus.
Empathizing.
Right. Empathizing is the drive to identify another person's emotions and thoughts and to respond to them with an appropriate emotion. Evolutionarily, this is vital for raising infants and maintaining harmony in small, vulnerable tribes.
So we have a strict binary setup. Systemizing versus empathizing. The pursuit of objective truth versus the pursuit of social consensus.
That's the baseline.
I want to throw an analogy out there to help visualize what Riker's getting at, because it really clarifies his panic.
Let's hear it.
Riker seems to view society like a massive, incredibly complex tech infrastructure. He's essentially arguing that civilization is trying to run heavy, complex processing things like maintaining a global supply chain, running a fair justice system, or managing a nuclear grid on an empathy operating system.
That is a great way to put it.
And because empathy isn't designed to process hard objective logic or make ruthless utilitarian calculations, the whole civilization is starting to glitch, freeze, and eventually crash.
That analogy captures his thesis perfectly. He literally calls it a catastrophic system failure. The hard-coded hardware of civilization, the infrastructure, is being forced to run on the software of hyper-empathy.
And he traces this difference even deeper, right? Right down to the endocrinology level.
Oh, yeah, he goes
Yeah.
deep. He brings in Alan Mazur's pioneering research from the 1980s on the effects of testosterone.
This is interesting because normally when we hear the word testosterone brought up in modern cultural critiques, it is almost exclusively linked to negative traits.
Right, like aggression, toxicity, violence, lack of control.
But Riker flips that entirely on its head, doesn't he?
He does. He frames testosterone not as the hormone of blind, irrational aggression, but as the vital fuel for the rational pursuit of order.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. He looks at Mazur's studies, which suggest that testosterone is tied to dominance and status seeking, yes, but in a highly structured way.
Okay.
Riker argues that when a man is operating within his natural biological purpose, testosterone actually optimizes his brain for strategic action. Furthermore, he points to research suggesting testosterone actually suppresses the stress hormone, cortisol.
Wait, really? So a man fueled by testosterone, in Riker's view, isn't flying off the handle in a rage. He is actually insulated from panic. He is calm under pressure.
Exactly. When the crisis hits, the testosterone-fueled brain doesn't dissolve into panic. It instantly attempts to establish a chain of command and find a mechanical solution to the crisis.
And he contrasts this, presumably.
Vehemently. He contrasts this supreme biological function with what he terms the cortisol-driven hysteria of modern feminist activism.
How does he define that hysteria?
Well, he paints this incredibly vivid picture of modern protests. Activists screaming at the sky, crying in the streets over political results.
Right, we've all seen the viral videos.
He describes this as a pure cortisol tsunami. It's a biological temper tantrum, completely devoid of the testosterone required to actually build a functional solution to whatever they are protesting.
It's all alarm system, no fire truck.
Perfect way to phrase it.
And he claims this biological difference isn't just an abstract theory about feelings, right? He says it has a brutal, measurable cost in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. To back this up, he brings in data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
This is one of the foundational pillars of his worldview.
It really is. The text cites the statistic that year after year, roughly 92.7% of all fatal work injuries are suffered by men.
So it's the men falling off the cell towers, getting crushed in the logging camps, drowning on the deep-sea fishing rigs.
Exactly. Riker uses this incredibly stark statistic to build what he calls an irrefutable Aristotelian syllogism.
Walk us through the mechanics of that syllogism. How exactly does he draw a line from workplace fatality statistics to the conclusion that civilization is inherently patriarchal?
Okay, it goes like this. Premise A. The very existence of civilization requires the violent physical subjugation of harsh environments and natural elements.
Right. We have to blast through mountains to build roads, extract highly volatile energy from the earth, and maintain electrical grids in freezing storms. Nature does not want to be tamed.
Exactly. The lights don't just stay on by magic.
No, they don't.
So then, premise B. This subjugation necessitates a massive statistical toll of human disposability. People have to die to keep the machine running, and as proven by that 92.7% fatality rate, the people dying are overwhelmingly men.
Okay, so what's the conclusion?
The conclusion, therefore, is that civilization itself is not a neutral, organically occurring space. It is a direct expression of masculine sacrifice and patriarchal protection. The safety of the modern world is essentially purchased with male blood.
He has a really striking quote about this. He says, quote, "They want the treasure of the king without bleeding in the mud of the soldier."
Yes. That quote sums it up perfectly. And this leads him to formulate his concept of the competence parasite.
The competence parasite. Explain that.
Riker argues that because the feminine imperative, this hyper-empathic, consensus-seeking drive, is biologically incapable of building or maintaining large-scale, dangerous systems, it cannot exist on its own in a state of nature.
Because it cannot engineer the power grids.
Right. Therefore, it must act as a parasite. It has to occupy the safe structures built by the extreme male brain, the universities, the corporate HR departments, the government bureaucracies, and slowly drain their resources while simultaneously shaming and policing the very men who built the walls, keeping the wolves out.
Man, that is a heavy accusation.
It's his core belief.
So if we follow his logic, this biological drive for order, this testosterone-fueled systemizing, didn't just build the physical roads, the bridges, and the power grids. He argues it also built the foundational philosophies of the West.
The intellectual architecture.
Exactly. And this transitions us seamlessly into the classical history that the book's title references. Let's look at what he calls the philosophical fortress.
Riker views the entire history of Western philosophy as a series of masculine fortifications designed to hold back emotional chaos.
And he starts this timeline in ancient Greece with what he terms the Athenian blueprint.
Yeah, he focuses almost exclusively on Plato and Aristotle here.
Why them? Why not Socrates or Epicurus?
Because for Riker, Plato's theory of forms is the ultimate masculine metaphysical assertion.
Okay, refresh our memory on the theory of forms.
If you think back to Philosophy 101 and Plato's allegory of the cave, the idea is that people are chained in a cave looking at mere shadows of reality on the wall. But outside the cave, there is the blinding sun, the ultimate truth.
Right.
The theory of forms proposes that there is an objective reality, an absolute essence of truth, that exists completely independent of human perception.
In other words, the truth exists regardless of how you feel about it, whether you vote on it or whether it offends your cultural sensibilities.
Precisely. The truth does not require your consensus. And Riker pairs this Platonic ideal with Aristotle's law of non-contradiction.
Which is?
This is the foundational rule of logic, stating that a proposition cannot be both true and false in the same respect at the same time. A cannot be not A.
Okay, so it's binary logic.
Right. Riker calls these philosophical concepts the masculine blades that sever humanity from the chaos of superstition and subjective emotion. He argues that the Athenian tradition wasn't just an ancient debate club.
It was more than that.
Much more. It provided a rigid intellectual grid that forced reality into compliance.
But then he violently contrasts this glorious, rigorous Athenian past with his view of modern universities. And to make his point, he brings in the research of social psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff.
Right. Haidt and Lukianoff wrote a highly influential piece in The Atlantic back in 2015 called The Coddling of the American Mind, which they later expanded into a book.
And what was their main focus?
They focused on the sudden rise of safetyism on college campuses.
Safetyism.
Yeah, the idea that words can be literal violence and that students need to be protected from ideas that make them uncomfortable. Riker heavily co-opts this research to serve his own thesis.
How does he adapt their research into his framework of the masculine versus the feminine?
He argues that historically, universities were uniquely masculine spaces. They were the modern equivalent of the agora, the ancient marketplace of ideas.
Where you go to battle intellectually.
Exactly. They were designed to forge the intellect through rigorous, often brutal debate and friction. You brought your idea to the arena, and if it was weak, it was destroyed by logic.
But Riker claims that modern universities have completely abandoned this masculine friction.
Oh, completely. They have replaced the aggressive pursuit of objective truth with infantilized safe spaces, trigger warnings, and speech codes.
And he doesn't see this as a misguided attempt at kindness or inclusivity, does he?
Not at all. He sees it as the ultimate triumph of the feminine imperative. It is the institutionalization of the idea that protecting emotional fragility is more important than discovering objective reality.
Wow.
For Riker, a university that issues a trigger warning for a classic novel has stopped being a university. It has become a nursery. He calls it the death of the agora.
And from the intellectual heights of Greece, he moves the deep dive to the brutal pragmatism of Rome. Because if Greece provided the intellectual blueprint for civilization, Rome provided the architecture of power and logistics.
And then he uses a very specific, bloody historical story to make his point about leadership.
Yes, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Set the scene for us. What happened in this forest, and why is it so significant to the manosphere worldview?
It's a legendary military disaster that Riker uses as a cautionary tale about the absolute dangers of abandoning the strict chain of command.
What?
In 9 AD, the Roman general Publius Quintilius Varus led 3 highly trained Roman legions, roughly 20,000 men deep into the dense, muddy Germanic forests.
Which was dangerous territory.
Very. They were ambushed by an alliance of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, and the Roman army was completely annihilated. It was a slaughter that permanently halted Roman expansion into Germania.
But Riker isn't writing a military history book. He's not critiquing the Roman shield wall or their marching formations. He's analyzing the psychology of the defeat.
Exactly. Riker claims that the disaster didn't happen because the Romans were outfought. It happened because of how Varus chose to lead.
How so?
According to Riker's analysis, Varus possessed the formal title of general, but he completely lacked the spine of a commander.
What was his fatal flaw?
The fatal error, according to the text, is that Varus tried to be inclusive.
Inclusive in 9 AD.
Yeah. He treated his conquered enemies, specifically Arminius, who was acting as a trusted advisor, as equal partners. Instead of imposing Roman will, Varus engaged in collaborative brainstorming sessions.
Oh, I see where he's going with this.
Right. He allowed native advisors to dilute his command structure. He relied on consensus building, trust, and diplomacy, rather than the strict, uncompromising logistical hierarchy that built the Roman Empire in the first place.
Wait, so it sounds like he's saying Varus essentially tried to run his legions like a modern corporate retreat,
Yeah.
and it got 20,000 men slaughtered in the mud.
That is exactly the parallel he draws. He uses Teutoburg Forest as a direct, aggressive warning against modern corporate diversity and inclusion committees.
That's a wild parallel.
It is, but he leans into it. He argues that whenever a man in a position of power permits multiple voices, whether it's an HR department, a feminist state bureaucracy, or a diversity committee to dilute his sovereign command, he invites his own psychological and structural annihilation.
Because a committee cannot lead in a crisis.
Exactly. Only a unified, unquestioned patriarch can lead. It's the concept of the unity of command.
But the fortress isn't complete yet. He has the logic of Athens, the military hierarchy of Rome, and then he brings in religion. He specifically co-opts Judeo-Christian theology, focusing on figures like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas to complete this civilizational architecture.
Riker argues that the Judeo-Christian framework provided the West with an absolutely vital psychological grid. He claims that before this theological grid took hold, the ancient pagan mind was trapped in what he calls cyclical despair.
Explain cyclical despair. What does that mean for the average person living back then?
In many ancient pagan traditions, time was viewed as a circle. Empires rise, empires fall, seasons change, and everything repeats endlessly.
There is no ultimate goal.
Right. It's a prison of eternal, meaningless recurrences. It's Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill forever, only to watch it roll back down.
But Riker argues that Judeo-Christianity introduced the concept of linear time.
Exactly. History has a beginning, a moral progression, and an ultimate destination. And more importantly, he argues this religion introduced a strict ethical legalism.
And he leans heavily on the sociologist Max Weber to prove why this legalism mattered economically, right?
He does. He heavily cites Max Weber's famous 1905 work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
Which is a classic text.
It is. Riker uses Weber to argue that the immense discipline, the delayed gratification, and the moral pursuit of worldly mastery inherent in this patriarchal theology were the direct fuel for the unprecedented expansion of capitalism and Western prosperity.
So you worked hard, you suppressed your base desires, and you built wealth as a sign of moral virtue.
Precisely. And he vehemently contrasts this strict ethical legalism with what he sees as the modern left's obsession with hedonistic flesh worship.
Hedonistic flesh worship.
Yeah, the demand for instant emotional gratification and the celebration of every subjective impulse.
Okay, let's hold on that for a second, because I think there's a massive historical leap being made here.
Let's hear it.
The author is taking ancient Athenian philosophy, which was highly theoretical,
Right.
and the brutal, conquering pragmatism of the Roman military machine, and the deeply theological, often ascetic ethics of medieval Christianity. And he's mashing them all together into one unified, monolithic, patriarchal inheritance.
He's definitely doing that.
But if you actually look at history, early Christianity was often fundamentally, violently opposed to Roman pragmatism. Athens and Rome had vastly different views on governance. Does this unified theory actually hold water historically?
From the perspective of an academic historian, it is highly problematic and incredibly selective. You cannot seamlessly fuse Aristotle, Julius Caesar, and Thomas Aquinas into one perfectly aligned political party.
It just doesn't work.
No, but we have to understand what Riker's doing. He isn't writing a nuanced, peer-reviewed history. He is actively forging a mythos.
He is constructing an intellectual lineage for his reader.
Exactly. He wants the modern, alienated man to feel like he is part of an ancient, continuous line of systemizing men who have been fighting back the forces of chaos since the dawn of time.
It's an origin story. It gives a sense of epic purpose to someone who feels marginalized by modern culture.
It's very powerful rhetoric.
It is. But that raises the million-dollar question. If this patriarchal fortress was so incredibly strong, if it possessed the unbreakable logic of Plato, the invincible legions of Rome, and the divine theology of Aquinas, how did it fall?
Right. How did the parasite breach the walls?
Exactly. And this brings us to a fascinating, albeit deeply conspiratorial, part of our analysis. The author maps out a timeline of decay that he calls the gynocentric vector theory.
Yes, the historical pivot. Riker has to explain how a civilization of titans allowed themselves to be subjugated.
Where does he start?
He traces the very first symptom of the infection back to the year 1762 to the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his highly influential treatise on education, Emile.
Why Rousseau? Of all the thinkers in history, why does Riker point the finger at him?
Because Rousseau championed the concept of the noble savage. Before Rousseau, the prevailing view championed by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes was that the natural state of man was a war of all against all, nasty, brutish, and short.
Civilization was the armor that kept us from killing each other.
But Rousseau flipped that. He argued that early humans lived in a pure, uncorrupted, peaceful state of nature, guided by natural empathy. According to Rousseau, it was the rigid structures of civilization property, laws, hierarchy that corrupted humanity.
So civilization is the problem, not the solution.
Exactly. And Riker views this as the exact fatal moment when subjective, undisciplined feelings were elevated above stoic duty.
Interesting.
He argues that modern evolutionary psychology utterly obliterates the noble savage myth. He claims early man survived only through aggressive, violent, hierarchical dominance, not peaceful, empathic communes.
So to Riker, Rousseau is the intellectual godfather of the modern temper tantrum.
He made it intellectually fashionable to hate the very system that keeps you alive.
But, a bad philosophical take by a guy in a powdered wig in the 1700s doesn't explain the hyper-specific, bureaucratic nature of modern corporate HR or diversity initiatives.
No, it doesn't.
For that, the author argues there was a much more coordinated, deliberate effort later on. This brings us to his interpretation of the Frankfurt School. Let's dig into the mechanics of this because it is a very popular theory in these circles.
This is where Riker's gynocentric vector theory moves from abstract philosophy to what he views as active sabotage.
Okay?
In 1934, a group of academics from the Institute for Social Research, prominent figures like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, fled a collapsing Nazi-controlled Europe and eventually set up shop at Columbia University in New York.
And these were explicitly Marxist intellectuals.
Yes. They were trying to understand why the communist revolutions that swept Russia hadn't taken hold in the industrialized West. And Riker claims these intellectuals realized something crucial. Classical economic Marxism had failed in the West because rational, hardworking Western men were never going to violently overthrow a capitalist system that actually rewarded their competence.
The working class men were too busy building, earning, and providing for their families to start a revolution. The system was working for them.
Exactly.
So how did the strategy shift? How does this connect to the female-coded part of his theory?
According to the text, the strategy shifted from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism, or critical theory.
Okay.
Riker argues that these intellectuals realized they couldn't recruit the systemizing men, so they deliberately weaponized the feminine imperative.
Weaponized empathy.
Yes. He claims they targeted the biological predisposition of women toward consensus and hyper-empathy. The goal was to convince women and other marginalized groups that they were oppressed victims of the patriarchal chain of command, even if they were living in the most prosperous society in human history.
So instead of a war between the rich and the poor, it became a war between the oppressor and the oppressed along cultural lines.
Exactly. By doing this, Riker claims the Marxists were able to topple the entire societal structure from within without firing a single shot.
They replaced the hammer and sickle with a weaponized tear.
They hacked the operating system of the culture using empathy as a virus.
But to spread a virus across an entire civilization, you need a massive vector. You need a distribution network.
Right.
And this brings us to the author's take on modern media and a very specific piece of legislation, the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
Yes. Riker argues that the theories formulated by the Frankfurt School remained somewhat contained in academia until they were supercharged by the consolidation of mass media in the late 20th century.
Okay.
He points directly to the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton. He claims this was the match that lit the powder keg.
Because that act fundamentally deregulated broadcasting and allowed for massive media consolidation.
Precisely. Within a few short years, thousands of independent, locally owned radio and television stations were swallowed up by a half-dozen mega conglomerates. Riker states that when you centralize the means of communication, you centralize the manufacture of reality itself. He claims the independent, objective watchdog press died, and in its place rose a gynocentric echo chamber.
What does that echo chamber actually sound like, in his view?
He argues that the consolidated media stopped reporting objective facts and instead began broadcasting a continuous feminized soap opera. News became about narratives, emotional manipulation, and highlighting victimhood to trigger the hyper-emotional centers of the brain.
And he ties this directly to the philosopher Herbert Marcuse's concept of repressive tolerance.
He does.
Explain Marcuse's concept, because that sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Repressive tolerance is the idea that to achieve true liberation, a society must be highly intolerant of right-wing, traditional, or oppressive ideas, while being endlessly tolerant of left-wing revolutionary ideas. Riker claims the consolidated media adopted this as their operating system. They aggressively silence, deplatform, and cancel any voice supporting the objective patriarchal order, and they do it all under the moral guise of protecting the marginalized from harm.
But, I mean, think about the timeline he is presenting here.
It's a long one.
He is drawing a perfectly straight, continuous line from an 18th century French philosopher writing about nature to a group of 1930s German academics fleeing the Nazis to a 1996 American telecom deregulation bill meant to boost corporate profits.
It's a massive span of history.
Doesn't that seem like a massive reach? Is this truly a grand, coordinated, century-long conspiracy of Marxist academics and media executives sitting in smoke-filled rooms actively plotting to destroy masculinity?
Or
Or is the author simply experiencing apophenia, seeing patterns in the natural, messy, completely uncoordinated evolution of modern civil rights, changing social norms, and the brutal capitalism of media consolidation?
it is the absolute definition of a grand unifying theory, and those are notoriously prone to confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Riker connects wildly disparate historical events because they all conveniently fit into his strict binary framework of masculine order versus feminine chaos.
It's a very compelling narrative for someone who feels alienated by the modern world.
It is, because it provides a specific enemy with a specific timeline. It's much easier to fight a coordinated cabal of Marxists than it is to grapple with the chaotic, leaderless, and incredibly complex shifts of a globalized culture.
But he doesn't just keep this argument in the realm of cultural theory and media studies. He makes it visceral.
Oh, he goes straight for the wallet.
Exactly. He moves the deep dive from the theoretical right into cold, hard economics. The author claims this female-coded Marxism isn't just annoying you on the news, it is literally reaching into your pocket and taking your money.
Let's examine what he calls economic enslavement and his view of the state as the beta provider.
Riker views the landmark legislation of the 1960s as the ultimate institutionalizing of this theft. He specifically targets the 1963 Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Which is wild because the vast majority of the public views those laws as monumental, unassailable achievements in basic fairness and workplace equality.
Right. But Riker views them through his lens of the competence parasite.
He views these laws as the legislative architecture that officially sanctioned the theft of masculine sovereignty.
Meaning what?
He argues that the entire concept of equitable distribution is nothing more than a legal euphemism for gynocentric wealth extraction. He claims these laws force companies to pay for emotional presence rather than purely objective output.
And he attempts to prove this by attacking one of the most frequently cited statistics in modern economics, the wage gap. He constructs another logical proof here. Break down the mechanics of the wage gap syllogism for us.
The author asks us to look closely at the fundamental profit motive of corporations. Premise 1. Corporations are pathologically, relentlessly driven by profit.
They will do literally anything, including offshoring millions of jobs, just to reduce operational costs by a fraction of a percent.
Exactly. Premise 2. The prevailing cultural narrative claims that women provide the exact same quality and quantity of labor for roughly 23% less pay.
The famous 77 cents on the dollar statistic.
Right. So Riker's logical conclusion is this. If the wage gap were objectively real, if women truly did the exact same work as men for 23% less money than profit-driven, ruthless corporations would instantly fire all the men.
Because they could hire exclusively women to cut their labor cost by nearly a quarter, instantly achieving a massive competitive advantage and destroying their rivals.
Exactly. Because corporations do not do this because they continue to hire expensive men, Riker claims the premise is demonstrably false.
So he thinks the gap is fake.
He states the raw wage gap is a mathematical lie that ignores multivariate analysis, things like overtime worked, danger pay, and continuous years in the workforce.
Right.
He argues the gap is a myth designed to evade personal responsibility for biological preferences regarding work-life balance.
But his economic critique goes much further than just corporate wages. He turns his sights on the welfare state itself.
Yes, specifically targeting President Lyndon B. Johnson and the rollout of the Great Society and the War on Poverty in 1964.
Right. Riker zeroes in on the massive expansion of the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, or AFDC.
He views this as the precise historical moment the federal government actively stepped in to usurp and replace the patriarchal father.
Explain the logic there. How does a welfare check replace a father?
He argues that historically, the female biological strategy for survival was to secure the commitment of a competent, systemizing man for provision and protection in exchange for family building.
Okay.
But Riker claims the welfare state short-circuited this evolutionary deal. The new strategy, he argues, is for women to vote for high-tax, left-wing legislators who will use the coercive power of the state to extract the wealth of competent men by force.
Through taxation.
Right, through taxation and redistribute it. The state, therefore, has officially become the ultimate beta provider.
He actually cites tax data to back this up, right?
He cites studies claiming that men, as a demographic cohort, pay the vast majority of net taxes into the system over a lifetime, while women, on average, consume vastly more in state benefits, healthcare, and subsidized services.
I want to introduce an analogy here to really summarize how Riker views the modern welfare state, because it's a terrifying image if you accept his premise.
Let's hear it.
He basically views the government like a biological parasite hijacking a host's nervous system. Think of a cordyceps fungus taking over an insect.
Creepy, but accurate to his point.
The host is the competent systemizing man who is out there producing capital, building businesses, and generating tax revenue. The parasite is the state. And the state secretes a paralyzing venom into the culture, a venom called unearned guilt or privilege or toxic masculinity.
Right.
This venom paralyzes the host's ability to defend himself, allowing the parasite to continuously extract the host's labor and resources to subsidize the chaotic, non-productive elements of society.
That is exactly the dynamic he is describing. He views taxation for the purpose of social equity, not as a necessary social contract to live in a civilized world, but as a literal form of biological enslavement.
And to prove that this empathy operating system and this parasitic welfare state are actually failing in the real world, the author doesn't just rely on tax data and economic theory.
No, he points to some very raw examples.
He points to specific, visceral, recent historical events as empirical proof of his worldview. Let's look at his real-world case studies of what he calls the estrogenic paradox.
The estrogenic paradox is perhaps the most crucial sociological concept in the book.
How does he define it?
Riker defines it as the biological reality where the feminine desire to protect everyone from immediate discomfort, to be hyper-empathic, to remove all friction and punishment, inevitably guarantees massive long-term systemic collapse and bloodshed.
So empathy creates violence.
In his view, yes. He argues that female-coded hyper-empathy does not create a peaceful, loving utopia. Instead, by removing consequences and boundaries, it generates unchecked, irresponsible violence.
And he points to the 1992 Los Angeles riots as a prime historical example to illustrate this paradox.
Yes. He paints a very stark contrast here. On one side, he describes the hyper-empathic, bureaucratic state, the city government, and the police leadership who, out of fear of political optics and escalating tensions, ordered the LAPD to pull back.
Who essentially surrendered the streets.
Exactly. The result was rioters burning down hundreds of unguarded structures, destroying the livelihoods of innocent people.
And what's the contrast?
He contrasts those burning buildings with the famous, iconic images of the Korean store owners, often referred to as the roof Koreans, who stood on top of their businesses with semi-automatic rifles to guard their property.
Oh, wow.
Riker uses this juxtaposition to say, look at the reality. The hyper-empathic state allowed the city to burn to the ground, while masculine, boundary-enforcing aggression, the very real threat of a rifle, was the only thing that actually preserved order, peace, and property.
He concludes the chapter by stating that true mercy requires a sword. Without the threat of violence, empathy is just weakness inviting predators.
That's his core takeaway.
He also brings up a much more recent, highly publicized example from 2020. The Capitol Hill occupied protest in Seattle, known as CHAZ or CHAB.
Riker dedicates a significant amount of analysis to CHAZ. He frames it as the ultimate petri dish of leftist utopianism.
Because during the protests of 2020, a group of activists took over several city blocks, declared it a police-free zone, and attempted to build a micro-society based entirely on the hyper-emotional whims of the collective.
Right. They explicitly removed the masculine chain of command, the police force, and objective law.
And according to Riker's analysis, how did that experiment go?
It was an unmitigated disaster that perfectly proved his thesis. Riker points out that within a matter of weeks, this empathy-driven utopia devolved into chaos.
armed warlords essentially took over the security of the zone.
Yeah, and it culminated in several tragic shootings, including the death of an innocent 19-year-old named Horace Lorenzo Anderson.
And Riker focuses heavily on the detail that Anderson bled out on a sidewalk because the chaotic, leaderless mob refused to allow official emergency medical services into their autonomous zone.
Exactly. For Riker, this is the ultimate fatal proof of his theory. When you replace the rational, hierarchical patriarch with the unmoored sentimentality of the hive, innocent people die.
But he doesn't just focus on violent street riots and autonomous zones. He also uses corporate and organizational failures to prove the parasite theory, specifically pointing to the monumental bankruptcy of the Boy Scouts of America in 2020.
This is his definitive corporate case study in the failure of what he calls appeasement.
Appeasement.
Riker tracks the history of the Boy Scouts, focusing on the period between 2013 and 2019. He details how the BSA leadership, facing intense pressure from the cultural left, attempted to appease their critics by altering their century-old masculine ethos.
They abandoned their traditional boundaries, changed their membership requirements, and eventually allowed girls to join the organization.
Right, and he says a parasite does not negotiate, it only consumes. He claims that by trying to appease irrational emotional demands, by trying to be inclusive and empathic, the Boy Scouts invited their own destruction.
He argues that the moment they compromised their masculine foundation, they lost their identity, leading directly to massive membership drops, endless litigation, and ultimate bankruptcy.
He uses this to argue a larger point. A masculine institution cannot survive feminine co-option. The feminine imperative fundamentally opposes the rigid hierarchy, discipline, and exclusivity required to maintain a high-functioning system.
Okay, we need to pause again and really look at the methodology here.
It's important to do so.
The author is using extreme, highly volatile flashpoints to make his case: the chaos of the LA riots, the anarchic breakdown of the CHAZ autonomous zone, and the bankruptcy of a massive organization that was already bogged down in decades of horrific abuse scandals. Right? We have to consider, do these extreme outlier events truly prove the everyday fundamental failure of empathy, inclusion, and equality? Or is this just the rhetoric of fear? It feels like he is taking the absolute worst, most chaotic moments of societal breakdown and projecting them onto the entire concept of a compassionate society.
That is the critical vulnerability in his argument. Riker uses the extreme catastrophic failures to define the everyday norm.
Right.
But he preempts this criticism. He argues that the underlying logic that creates a CHAZ is the exact same logic operating in your corporate HR department. It is simply at a different stage of metastasis.
He believes the cancer is the same, whether it's a small tumor in a diversity meeting or a terminal collapse in the streets.
That is his stance.
So we've walked through the entire architecture of his argument. We've seen the inciting incident of the mahogany table, the deep dive into evolutionary biology, the philosophical roots in Athens and Rome, the historical vector of the Frankfurt School, the economic theories on taxation, and the real-world case studies.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We arrive at the climax of the book's methodology. The diagnosis is terminal. The X-ray shows the bone is shattered. What is the rational, systemizing man supposed to actually do with all this overwhelming information?
Riker's solution is radical, but logically consistent with his diagnosis. He calls for a complete, unapologetic withdrawal from the infected system. He calls it entering monk mode.
Monk mode. Stepping out of Plato's cave and refusing to look the shadows anymore.
Yes. He views the modern corporate, social, and political structure as essentially the Matrix, a fraudulent gynocentric illusion designed specifically to harvest your energy and enslave you.
Entering monk mode means aggressively starving the beta provider state of the resources it uses to fund its war on masculinity.
Exactly.
So what does that look like practically? Is he advocating for illegal tax evasion?
No, he is careful to frame it as legally minimizing your tax footprint to the absolute lowest possible threshold, maximizing untaxed physical assets, moving off the grid where possible, and refusing to participate in consumer culture.
But the withdrawal is much more than just financial. It's deeply social.
Very much so. He commands his readers to ruthlessly cut off what he calls parasitic drains. This means severing ties with toxic, demanding women, but more notably, he insists on severing ties with weak, subjugated men who act as enforcers for the state apparatus.
You are to operate as an untouchable ghost within the society you once built.
A ghost, yes.
But you aren't just sitting in a dark room feeling sorry for yourself. You are supposed to be actively building your armor. And he has a very specific physical mechanism for this that he calls iron therapy.
Lifting heavy weights.
Yes, but he elevates the gym from a place to get fit into a site of profound philosophical necessity.
This is one of the most fascinating and intellectual leaps in the entire book. Riker actually applies the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative to the weight room.
Let's break that down, because Kant's is heavy philosophy. Kant's categorical imperative essentially states that you should only act according to a rule or maxim, that you would want to become a universal law for everyone.
Right. So Riker takes that ethical framework and applies it to biology. He argues that a society comprised of disciplined, physically hardened, highly capable men is a universal good that ensures survival, order, and protection for everyone.
Conversely, a society of sedentary, physically weak, emotionally fragile victims is a logical contradiction that inevitably collapses into chaos and death.
Therefore, he argues, physical strength is not a vanity project. It is a fundamental moral duty to prevent civilizational collapse.
Wow. And he uses the ancient Greek wrestler Milo of Croton as his supreme metaphor.
Milo of Croton, the guy who supposedly picked up a newborn calf and carried it on his shoulders every single day until it grew into a massive bull.
Exactly. It is the ancient myth of progressive overload. As the burden gets heavier, the man must grow stronger to bear it. Riker pairs this with modern thinker Nassim Nicholas Taleb's concept of anti-fragility.
Anti-fragility being the idea that some systems don't just resist stress, they actually require stress and volatility to grow stronger. Like a mythical hydra, you cut off one head to grow back.
Right. And Riker says the male body and the extreme male brain are the ultimate biological manifestations of anti-fragility.
When you step under a heavy barbell, you are engaging in a high-stakes, purely objective debate with the universe.
Gravity does not care about your feelings.
No, it does not. Gravity does not accept appeals to emotion or historical grievances. You either lift a weight or it crushes you. It is the purest form of systemizing truth left in the modern world.
And the ultimate goal of all this individual strengthening, the tax minimization, the isolation, the iron therapy, isn't just to be a lonely guy with big biceps. The goal is to build what he calls the parallel patriarchy.
He strictly warns against the lone wolf myth. He cites Aristotle's famous dictum that man is fundamentally a political animal. An isolated, hyper-strong prepper living in the woods alone is just a target waiting to be picked off by the collective.
You need a phalanx. You need a shield wall.
Exactly. You need networks of highly competent, aligned men. And to build this network, Riker utilizes a brilliant piece of sociology, Robert Michaels' 1911 concept, the iron law of oligarchy.
Which states that all complex organizations, no matter how democratic or egalitarian they are at their founding, will inevitably and eventually fall under the control of a small, dedicated elite, an oligarchy.
Riker argues that the political left implicitly understood and weaponized this iron law to create an artificial female-coded oligarchy based on victimhood and HR bureaucracy.
His solution is for rational men to stop fighting the old institutions and instead use the exact same iron law to establish a natural merit-based oligarchy in their own parallel institutions.
He wants them to build independent businesses, private networks, and traditional households that completely bypass the infected corporate structures and diversity gatekeepers.
Which brings me to a massive, glaring contradiction in the text that I simply cannot shake.
What is it?
The author spends 15 dense chapters glorifying men as the essential, indispensable builders of civilization. He argues that masculine energy built the bridges, forged the empires, laid down the civic societies, and constructed the aqueducts. But his ultimate climactic advice to his reader, the grand solution to the crisis, is to retreat to the countryside, hoard physical resources, legally dodge taxes, and essentially stop participating in the very society they allegedly built. If the fundamental masculine imperative is to build, to structure, and to maintain order, isn't monk mode just a massive surrender?
Riker would likely argue it's not a surrender, it's a tactical retreat. He would compare it to the Roman aristocrats who, seeing the writing on the wall, fled the decaying corrupt cities to their fortified, self-sufficient villas right before the Visigoths arrived to sack Rome.
Okay, I see that.
But you are entirely correct to point out the underlying tension. The book spends hundreds of pages demanding supreme rational command over reality, but its ultimate prescription is extreme isolationism and withdrawal.
It's fascinating. We've covered the inciting incident at the mahogany table, the neuroscience of the extreme male brain, the Athenian blueprint, the Frankfurt School's gynocentric vector theory, the wage gap syllogism, and the retreat into monk mode.
It is a massive intellectual framework.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, there is an incredible tension at the heart of this ideology. The author himself points out what he calls the irony of the Enlightenment.
This is a very sharp observation by Riker. He points out the terminal cognitive dissonance of the modern left.
What does he mean by that?
He notes that ideologically possessed activists use their iPhones, which are the literal physical manifestations of Baconian empiricism, Newtonian physics, and the extreme masculine drive to systemize reality, to tweet out hyper-emotional, anti-science rhetoric claiming that objective reality doesn't even exist.
It's the ultimate paradox. The systemizer spends decades building the microphone, and the empathizer uses it to silence him. But that actually leads me to a slightly terrifying thought that Riker doesn't even touch on in the book, and I want you to chew on this.
What's that?
Riker argues that the extreme male brain is defined by systemizing the relentless drive to build logical, objective, emotionless structures to conquer nature. But what is the ultimate logical conclusion of that drive? It's artificial intelligence.
Oh.
We are currently building silicon brains that can systemize reality, analyze data, and optimize logistics millions of times faster and more ruthlessly than any biological human male ever could. If Riker is right and society's survival depends purely on cold, objective computation and the suppression of emotion, then the masculine drive has just rendered itself entirely obsolete.
Because AI doesn't need testosterone.
Exactly. AI doesn't need a phalanx. It is the ultimate systemizer. So the profound irony might be that the extreme male brain didn't just build the tools of its own cultural silencing, as Riker fears. It built the exact technology that will make its biological necessity completely irrelevant.
That is a staggering implication. If the goal is pure, unfeeling efficiency, the machine will always eventually replace the man who built it.
I want to thank you for taking this incredibly intense, expansive deep dive with us today. We waded through some highly charged, deeply complex waters, and I hope we provided a clear, objective map of exactly how this polarizing movement constructs its reality.
It was definitely a challenging but necessary exploration.
As a reminder, if you want to read the source material and examine the arguments for yourself, Bolt of Zeus, Classical Masculine Power and Its Philosophical Defense by Conrad Riker is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It is undeniably a text that demands a rigorous, critical reading, regardless of where you stand on the cultural spectrum.
Definitely. Be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how his theories are evolving. And please remember to like and subscribe to our deep dive. It is the only way we can keep bringing you these custom-tailored, exhaustively detailed explorations into the books and ideas that are actively shaping our culture. Whether we agree with them or not, we'll see you next time.